The troubled relationship between Islam and the Jewish people didn't start yesterday. It began over 1400 years ago with the rise of Islam itself. The enduring conflict in Palestine is just one chapter in a complex history of tension that stretches back to Islam's very inception. But this story is far more complex than most realize. As a former Muslim, I've not only studied these teachings, but also witnessed firsthand the deep-seated resentment towards Jews that permeates many Muslim communities. In this video, I'll take you on a journey through time, exploring the origins of this conflict and how key moments in Islamic history still shape the relationship between Muslims and Jews today. In pre-Islamic Arabia, Jewish communities were well established, particularly in regions like Yathrib, later known as Medina, Khaybar, and the Hijaz. These communities likely migrated to the Arabian Peninsula during various periods of Jewish diaspora, possibly after the Romans decided to turn the Second Temple into rubble in 70 AD. They played significant roles in the local economies, engaging in agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. Jewish tribes such as the Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza coexisted alongside Arab tribes, forming alliances and engaging in both cooperation and conflict. Jewish presence in Arabia also had a religious and cultural impact. Some Arab tribes even picked up a few monotheistic habits from their Jewish neighbors. Then came the 7th century, and with it, a certain merchant from Mecca, Muhammad, who decided he had received the final, and I do mean final, revelation from God. As his message spread, it quickly attracted both followers and opponents. In 622 AD, Muhammad and his followers migrated from Mecca to Yathrib, which we now know as Medina. This city had a significant Jewish population. Upon his arrival, Muhammad sought to establish a multi-religious community through what was known as the Constitution of Medina. This agreement outlined the rights and duties of all citizens, including the Jews, who were allowed to maintain their religious practices. It even established a mutual defense pact. If the city was attacked, all inhabitants, regardless of religion, were expected to defend it together. But, as with most grand plans, this spirit of cooperation didn't last long. One of the big issues was that the Jewish tribes weren't exactly buying what Muhammad was selling in terms of prophethood. They believed prophecy was a family affair, reserved for the descendants of Isaac, and Muhammad, being from the Ishmael side of the family tree, didn't quite fit the bill. This theological divide deepened the rift between the Muslim and Jewish communities. The Quran even has a few choice words on the matter, like in Surah Al-Baqarah 288, where the Jews are called out for their disbelief. They said, "Our hearts are wrapped, but in fact Allah has cursed them for their disbelief. So little is it that they believe." Tensions escalated further when Jewish scholars in Medina decided to test Muhammad with some theological brain teasers. According to Islamic tradition, the Jews in Medina challenged Muhammad's prophetic claims by asking him to answer 3 specific questions. What is the soul? What happened to the young men who disappeared in ancient times? A reference to the story of the sleepers in the cave? And what do you know about the two-horned one? These questions were not just innocent inquiries. They were designed to test Muhammad's knowledge and the authenticity of his prophethood. When his answers didn't quite hit the mark, the skepticism dialed a few notches. While Muhammad struggled with these basic questions, I'll keep tackling the tough ones here on this channel. So if you're enjoying this video so far, please hit that subscribe button to help me get to my goal of 30,000 subs by the end of the year. Moving on, the Jews started doubting his legitimacy even more. After all, only a true prophet would nail these questions, right? The challenges didn't stop there. The Jews, along with a few others who weren't fully convinced, also demanded some good old-fashioned miracles like the ones Moses used to whip out back in the day. They wanted tangible proof that Muhammad was indeed a prophet, and let's just say, Muhammad's inability, or refusal, to deliver these signs didn't exactly win them over. The Quran hilariously addresses these demands in a few verses, often with a kind of divine side-eye, emphasizing that faith shouldn't depend on miracles, but on believing in the message itself. But shockingly, for those expecting parting seas or burning bushes, this explanation wasn't enough. The lack of miracles only deepened the rift, adding more fuel to the theological and political tension simmering between Muhammad and the Jewish tribes. This growing skepticism and rejection by the Jewish tribes is believed to have significantly affected Muhammad's attitude towards them, deepening the rift that eventually led to the conflicts and expulsions that followed. The first significant conflict arose with the Banu Qaynuqa tribe, They were accused of violating the terms of the constitution by showing hostility towards Muslims and mocking them. This led to a confrontation where the Muslim forces besieged the Banu Qaynuqa's fortress. After a short siege, the tribe surrendered and Muhammad ordered their expulsion from Medina. This tribe was then forced to leave their properties behind and were then exiled to Syria. Next came the conflict with the Banu Nadir tribe. Tensions escalated after an alleged assassination plot against Muhammad by this tribe. In response, Muhammad demanded that the tribe leave Medina. After a 2-week siege, the Banu Nadir were forced into exile, allowed to take what they could carry, but leaving behind their land and wealth. They resettled in the oasis of Khaybar, where they continued to have a significant presence. The most tragic confrontation involved the Banu Qurayza tribe. During the Battle of the Trench in 627 AD, the Banu Qurayza were accused of conspiring with the enemy against the Muslims. After the Confederate forces were repelled, Muhammad laid siege to the Banu Qurayza's stronghold. Following their surrender, the men of the tribe were executed, and the women and the children were enslaved. These conflicts had a profound and lasting impact on the Jewish presence in Arabia. The expulsion and tragic fate of these tribes effectively ended significant Jewish influence in Medina. Those who survived often resettled in other parts of Arabia like Khaybar or further afield in the Levant. These events also set a precedent for how Islamic communities would treat non-Muslims, particularly Jews, in subsequent centuries. There's something interesting about the Quran verses revealed within this period, by the way. You see, when Muslims and Jews were first getting to know each other, back when things were still somewhat civil, there were some pretty peaceful verses revealed. You know, the ones about how we're all people of the book and should get along, hold hands and sing Kumbaya or something like that. These are the verses Muslim apologists love to quote. They'll tell you, look, Islam is all about peace. Just read the verse right here. But here's the kicker. They conveniently forget to mention the concept of abrogation. Abrogation is this nifty little trick where later revelations, usually the more aggressive ones, cancel out the earlier, peaceful verses. And there's a pretty clear pattern to it too. When Muhammad was just starting out, let's call it the Mecca phase, he was preaching to anyone who would listen, and he didn't have much power. So naturally, the verses were all about peace, tolerance, and trying to win people over with kindness. But then Muhammad gains power, moves to Medina, builds up an army, and surprise, surprise, the tone of the revelations changes. Suddenly, those earlier peaceful verses get replaced by some much tougher talk. It's almost like once Muhammad had the power to back up his words, he didn't need to play nice anymore. The let's all get along verses were effectively swapped out for a royal rumble in Arabia. So, while those nice, friendly verses get trotted out as proof of Islam's peaceful nature, the harsher, more combative verses are often left out of the conversation. Probably because they don't fit the narrative as nicely. But hey, why let a little thing like abrogation, or historical context, get in the way of a good PR campaign, right? A rather famous hadith that came out of this conflict was about Judgment Day not arriving until Muslims get rid of all of the Jews. This hadith has also been often chanted and even written down on posters at pro-Palestine protests across the West recently. Let's get back to history. Following these conflicts, the concept of dhimmi was developed, referring to non-Muslims living under Islamic rule. This was a special status for non-Muslims living under Islamic rule, protected but definitely not equal, living as second-class citizens who had to pay a special tax in exchange for their protection. After the Medina conflicts, Muhammad wasn't done expanding his influence. He turned his sights on Khaybar in 628 AD, where many of the Banu Nadir had resettled. Khaybar was an oasis known for its fertile lands and strong fortresses. The Jews of Khaybar resisted, but after a series of battles, their fortresses were captured. Interestingly, instead of kicking them out, Muhammad allowed them to stay under one condition: they had to give half of their annual produce to the Muslims. This arrangement turned the Jews of Khaybar into tenant farmers on what used to be their own land, now under Muslim control. The Battle of Khaybar is often brought up as a prime example of how Jewish communities were subjugated under Islamic rule. It reinforced the idea that Jews could live in Muslim lands, but only as a protected, subordinate class, contributing to the economy, sure, but with no real autonomy. What's particularly striking is how this historical event has echoed through the centuries, even to this day. In many recent pro-Palestinian protests, you might have heard the chant, which translates to Khaybar Khaybar, or Jews, the army of Muhammad will return. This chant invokes the memory of Muhammad's victory over the Jews as a modern-day threat, a chilling reminder of how historical conflicts continue to fuel contemporary hostility. Muhammad's death in 632 AD marked the end of an era. By this point, the Arabian Peninsula was largely under Islamic control, and the Jews who remained were living under the dhimmi system. Now, you might think that with the Prophet gone, things could have settled down a bit for the Jewish communities in the Arabian Peninsula. But no, things didn't exactly improve. In fact, the roller coaster was just getting started. First up, we have the apostate wars. These were launched by the new Caliph, Abu Bakr, to deal with the tribes that thought, maybe we don't want to be Muslims after all, now that Muhammad was gone. As an apostate myself, I totally understand, honestly. The Jews weren't the main targets here, but the message was clear. Islam wasn't about to tolerate any group that didn't submit to its authority. Under the first four caliphs, the so-called rightly guided caliphs, Islamic expansion kicked into high gear. Muslim armies rapidly spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and even into parts of Europe. As the Islamic Empire grew, Jewish communities found themselves spread across various regions, from the Levant to North Africa and even into Spain. Now, Al-Andalus is often romanticized as a golden age for Jews under Islamic rule, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews supposedly lived in harmony, exchanging knowledge and culture. But as with most things in history, the reality was a bit more complicated. Yes, there were periods where Jewish scholars thrived, contributing to science, philosophy, and literature. But this wasn't some utopia of equality. Jews still lived under the dhimmi system, meaning they were second-class citizens, tolerated but never truly equal. And when the political winds shifted, things could get pretty ugly. One of the most famous Jewish scholars of this period, Maimonides, didn't exactly have glowing reviews of the dhimmi status. He famously wrote, "You know, my brethren, that on account of our many sins, God has cast us among this people, the nation of Ishmael, who persecute us severely, and who devise ways to harm us and to debase us. None has matched it in debasing and humiliating us. None has been able to reduce us as they have. We have borne their imposed degradation, their lies and absurdities, which are beyond human power to bear." So, while some apologists might paint a rosy picture of this golden age, Maimonides' words offer a pretty stark contrast, don't they? Take, for example, the Almohads, a Berber Muslim dynasty that took over Al-Andalus in the 12th century. The Almohads weren't exactly known for their tolerance. They forced Jews to either convert to Islam, flee, or face persecution. This marked the end of the so-called golden age for Jews in Al-Andalus, forcing many to flee to more tolerant regions in Europe or the Middle East. Moving forward a bit, the Ottoman Empire, which rose to power after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, became home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the Islamic world. The Ottomans, like the early caliphs, classified Jews as dhimmis. Again, Jews were allowed to practice their religion, but always within the constraints of the dhimmi system. Interestingly, the Ottomans did provide some refuge to Jews expelled from Spain during the Inquisition. So, while Jewish life under Ottoman rule wasn't exactly a walk in the park, it was often better than what they faced in Europe at the time. As we moved into the later centuries, the position of Jews in the Islamic world continued to fluctuate. In some places, they were relatively well off, enjoying periods of peace and prosperity, but in others, they faced intense persecution, forced conversions, and expulsions, particularly during times of political instability or religious fervor. As we move into the modern era, these pressures only intensified. The rise of nationalism and the creation of the State of Israel marked a turning point, leading to the rapid decline of once thriving Jewish communities in places like Iraq, Egypt, and Morocco. For many Jews, emigration to Israel, Europe, or the Americas became not just a choice, but a matter of survival. Perhaps what's most troubling is how the anti-Semitic attitudes that were ingrained centuries ago are still very much alive today. Let me give you a stark example. According to the Pew Global Attitudes Project released in 2005, the levels of anti-Semitism in Muslim-majority countries are staggering. In Turkey, 60% of the population holds unfavorable views of Jews. In Pakistan, it's 74%. In Indonesia, it's 76%. Morocco, 88%. But it gets even worse. In Lebanon, 99% of Muslims surveyed checked somewhat unfavorable or very unfavorable when asked about their views of Jews. And in Jordan, it's a chilling 100%. Now, you might wonder, why are these numbers so high? Why is anti-Semitism so deeply rooted in these communities? Well, as we have discussed, the roots of this animosity can be traced back to the early days of Islam. The dhimmi status, the conflicts with Jewish tribes, the abrogation of peaceful verses in favor of more aggressive ones, all of these historical factors laid the groundwork for deeply ingrained hostility towards Jews that has persisted through the centuries. And here's the thing, it hasn't just stayed confined to Muslim communities. The ancient prejudice has reared its ugly head in the mainstream, particularly in the wake of the war in Gaza since last year, where chants like the Khaybar chant are being echoed, invoking the memory of Muhammad's conquest over the Jews as a modern-day threat. It's creeping into mainstream politics as well. Anti-Semitism, once something whispered or confined to private conversations, is now being shouted out loud and clear. As someone who grew up in a Muslim community, I've seen this anti-Semitism firsthand. It's not just a fringe belief. It's pervasive, often taught at home, in schools, and in mosques. It's so deeply embedded that many don't even recognize it as a prejudice. They see it as a simple, unquestioned truth. And that's the crux of the issue. This isn't just about a few bad apples or isolated incidents. Anti-Semitism, believe it or not, is fundamental in Islam, woven into the fabric of its teaching and its history. The historical conflicts, the theological rifts, the political power plays, all of these have left a legacy that continues to poison Jewish-Muslim relations today. So, when we see the hatred spilling into the streets, into our politics, and into our discourse, we have to recognize that this isn't something new. It's a continuation of a very old story, one that started over 1400 years ago and is still being written today. And until we confront this history honestly and openly, we're doomed to repeat it. These days, however, it appears, especially in the West, that this history, however, has been conveniently forgotten. If you enjoyed watching this video, please remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment your thoughts down below. You can also support me further by becoming a member and get some exclusive perks on Discord. I've left a link in the description down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.